All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program. I am your host, maybe if it'll advance. Let's see. There we go. I'm your host, Jaynie Adams, History Engagement Manager, Staff Historian, and Associate Editor of the Journal of Arizona History. A little bit about the Society before we get started. AHS is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution and a state agency established in 1864. AHS collects, preserves, and tells the story of Arizona's past through museum exhibits, libraries and collections, outreach, educational programs, and through publishing. AHS preserves our past, shares our state stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona's history. Support for programming like this comes in part from membership dues. If this kind of programming speaks to you and you'd like to see more of it, consider becoming a member of the Society. Members get free admission to AHS museums, special members-only events, and members' pricing for programs, print copies of the Journal of Arizona History, and so much more. For information about membership, you can visit us online at azhs.org. And speaking of ways to stay connected with us, there are lots of ways to connect with the Society. You can sign up for our email list, follow us on social media, explore one of our museums, and you can learn about all the things that we do at the Arizona Historical Society online at azhs.org. Some helpful reminders for today's session. This is a Zoom webinar, so Dr. Berman and I, we can't see or hear you. So if you're having an early lunch, feel free to keep eating. Use the Q&A feature for comments and questions. We are in the middle of our Arizona Histories American Stories series, and the next installment of this series is going to be in 3 weeks, maybe it's 2 weeks, on April 8th at 12 p.m. So this one is going to be about resources from the AHS archives, so that one will be exciting. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. David Berman. David Berman is a professor emeritus of political science at Arizona State University. He is the author of several books and articles on Arizona and the West, including the book Governor Hunt, Arizona's Crusading Seven-Term Governor, now available in paperback from the University of Arizona Press. So, Dr. Berman, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Enjoy.
Yeah. So this is a little bit of for our audience, this will be a little bit of a different format than these presentations are typically going to be. We're going to do more of an interview style. So to kick off our interview, Dr. Berman, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your research?
Yes, I'm a native of Illinois, born not too far from Chicago. I came out here in 1964, I think. I met Sam Goddard right off the bat, who was governor. And I had been in Washington, D.C., where I did my graduate work, had never been west of Iowa, and decided to see Arizona. I got a job offer, and I thought, well, why not? I'd never been there. And although my father was thinking about coming out there, he had asthma many years ago. But anyhow, I got out here and joined the Department of Political Science. I was always interested in the progressive era. That was one of my preoccupations as a student. And I also was interested in state government as well as local government. And when I got here, this was like having a field trip of my own. I was very interested in what was happening in the state and what was happening on the local level. I got to know several people. And I decided to do what political scientists do, and that is a lot of election analysis, and but using historical data in Arizona and looking at territorial elections. And early during the populist progressive era, 1890 to 1920, basically, was the era that I selected. And I gathered all these statistics. I found out I got the voting records and I got all the census records, and I was able to break down the elections into various cities and towns. Very often, there weren't many precincts there. Most of the places weren't big enough to have precincts. And so you talked about a whole town voting. I could get data on people who lived in the various towns, also what they did for a living, cattle, whatever they were doing, mining. And I did a lot of journal articles, statistical articles, and I finally occurred to me that maybe I have a book here, and I knew something about voting returns, but I didn't know much about the people who were voting or the characters they were voting for, and I decided to become more of an historian in the sense of digging up information on what was actually happening and what people thought and who was involved. Found out George Hunt was a hell of an interesting guy, and I thought he'd be wonderful to talk about. He deserved the book. And but I went on from I have a habit when I write a book of over researching, and I always have a lot left over from my research when my book is done. So I have enough ideas and new material to start another book, and so I always have a book in mind when I'm writing another book. So a lot of my work is serendipity. I find things I haven't been looking for, and very often, and I put them aside so I can finish the book, and then I go back to them. So I spend a lot of time writing, and writing books, particularly. I usually go with University Press, but I have other lines of research, but I spent a great deal of time working on the 1890, 1920 period, looking at the populists and the progressives, and all around the country as well as here, but most of the work has been in Arizona. And so that pretty much gives you some idea of what I've been doing and a little bit about how I do it.
Isn't it amazing how something so mundane like a ballot or an election return can be such a rich document for understanding not just kind of what's happening in a quantitative way, but really what people's quality of life is like? Like, that's just so fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I think there's sort of a fun to doing quantitative work because two things all of a sudden come together, and wow, I didn't know that. And I do sort of factor analysis. I just get all the data, put in the computer, and then I see strings of relationships, and I pull them out. It's a way of proceeding. And actually, much of my writing is the same way. I just put all the information I have and then look for similarities and comparisons in the data set that I have. But the research is quantitative research is not enough. I don't think. I think you have to go beyond it and talk about the people. And as a political scientist, my interest has been in behavior. I'm why people do things is to me important, and what they were trying to do and what they accomplished. So it's not just storytelling so much as it is understanding why people did the things that they did, and why the institutions operated the way they did. I just try to get the best information I possibly can, and so you can use quantitative techniques as well as qualitative ones. I think you can mix the two, and that's what I've been trying to do for most of my career. The progressive era has always been fascinating to me, as I mentioned, and political scientists and historians, I think, they're pretty well agreed that there wasn't a thing called the progressive movement. There was a lot of movements, a lot of causes that were going on at the same time, particularly in the year 1900 to 1920, say, and that the word progressive usually meant simply this person was a progressive who was trying to change the status quo in some way or another, improve the education system, improve the penal system, start thinking new about the role of women and the employer-employee relationships. It just it would have been a wonderful era to live in. I mean, there were ideas popping off the walls. A lot of them were started many years ago, and many surfaced in the populist era in the 1890s. But they all seemed to crush together in that period. So that Hunt was just alive. He thought, my God, I'm in a period where things are happening, things are changing, and he was not well educated, so his reading skills were limited. But he was talking to everybody and going to meetings all the time and lectures. He had a great deal of intellectual curiosity, and he was trying to put that all together. But he, like a lot of people, thought, "My God, we're changing things," and this is an era where we're moving on, even to changing people. The eugenics cause was sort of brought into progressivism. The idea was that people who were, and I think this was bad science, but the theme was these people who were feeble-minded or criminally inclined, got it from their ancestors, and it was handed down biologically. And you want to stop that, you make it, you sterilize them so they can't reproduce. This was bad science. But Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson thought, hey, this is a good idea. We can.
Teddy, Mr. Berman, it's fascinating how there's when I always talk to folks about this, I say there's the big P progressive, which is this like time period and these movements, and you're right. It's this idea that you can kind of use the power of government or the power of organizing to enact these major changes, and like you were saying, these are things that people wouldn't even dreamed of 40 years earlier. But it's not always the same as little p progressive, right? This idea that like we're always moving forward, we're always improving, and there's a gap between those two things sometimes. And as modern day folks who have the benefit of hindsight, when we look back on this time period, sometimes we don't quite see the novelty of some of these ideas and the excitement behind some of these ideas. So, you had kind of defined the progressive era for us, and Arizona kind of comes of age during the progressive era. What is that? How is that different than like a national progressive movement?
Well, there were all kinds of movements, and they did vary somewhat from the east to the west. And probably one of the best representatives of the West in this regard was George Hunt, who was governor of Arizona, actually for 6-7 terms. They were short terms, and sometimes he actually lost, but he wound up winning in court. It wasn't. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But he was George Hunt had three. He like a lot of progressives of the period had their own reform packages, and it's sort of interesting to compare one governor or one progressive politician who was trying to change something, but what he was trying to change, what was his package like compared to another governor? George Hunt had three things that he really wanted to do. One was probably the most popular progressive cause in terms of government structure, was simply to free it from the domination of the special interest and the wealthy. There's a lot in the progressive period that's pretty much like the discussions we're having currently. They were millionaires, not billionaires at the time, but they were robber barons, people who were ripping off the public, Rockefellers versus the little fellows, sort of conflict, and they were people who were monopolies were forming and controlling the markets and controlling the workforce, and he wanted his crusade. This first crusade was we need the public control of those people. We need the people have to rule. And this was his instruments that he promoted and were very popular in Arizona were the initiative referendum and the recall, the direct democracy reforms, so that people could make their own laws or invalidate the laws made by corrupt legislatures and even get rid of the legislators by voting them out of office short of their term expiring. And he was very insistent on that, and that was a very popular cause. His second cause, and where he differed somewhat by a lot of people who called themselves progressives, and they had different packages, but he put great emphasis on the working people and their protections by joining unions, getting a better distribution of income to those people through union activity, improving their lives. He looked at it as the people versus the interest, people versus the special interest. The special interest in Arizona, he equated with the large mining companies and the railroads. These were the corruptors, and they were the invisible government that was there, really controlling everything. And it was, of course, a politically popular thing, but it also made some enemies from the big corporations. So he had trouble there, and there were many people who followed him because of the direct democracy kind of focus, who weren't too thrilled about labor. They looked at labor as a radical component of the coalition, who were with the Western Federation of Miners, and then later on the Industrial Workers of the World. These were pretty radical people, and there were a lot of progressives who voted for Hunt who said, "Well, I'm not too sure about the labor people," and Teddy Roosevelt wasn't too crazy about labor unions, and Wilson was not. And a lot of the Eastern people were not into the labor camp. Hunt stood out with Davis Wade in Colorado as the two really ardent champions of labor, and he was serious and very committed to the cause. The third thing he was committed to in his reform package was the correcting the criminal justice system. He hated the death penalty, and he worked feverishly to abolish it. It was just, and he also was big on prison reform, making them more humane institutions. He got rid of the uniforms and all the idea that punishment, the prisons for punishment, and he looked at for prisoners for rehabilitation, and he thought that first offenders at least could be cured, that they could be. The theme of the progressives was this environment counts. And if you change the environment in which somebody's raised, that they go in a different direction. And he thought of poor housing, poverty, all kinds of things, slums affecting crime. So he really was. He was not a eugenist. He didn't care for that kind of approach. He took the approach of environmental reform. He was accused of coddling criminals, of being soft on crime, the kind of things that would be happening today too. I mean, he lost a lot of people went along with him because they liked the direct democracy thing, and he made that his issue. But when he talked about labor, radical labor, the IWW, the Western Federation of Miners, the people who were being coddled by the government and making clubs out of prisons, he lost popularity. And of course, the people who didn't like him, the capitalists, the big money people, would attack him on his most vulnerable positions, and those were in the criminal justice area. And most of the complaints about what he was doing in terms of criminal justice came as from the people who didn't like what he was doing in terms of getting into interfering with their ability to run their companies and pay their taxes and all that sort of thing. But so he had a lot of trouble. Now the package was different, and there were governors in Colorado and other places who really were into labor. But the thing that really defined the progressive movement in Arizona and the West was democracy. Uh, this was an area which was big on women's suffrage. Well, the four of the first 5 states to recognize the right of women to have the vote were in this Rocky Mountain area. So this was and they were big on even now they stand out in terms of particularly Arizona and using the instruments of direct democracy in the referendum. We're going to have 20, 30 things on the ballot to vote on, I think, next time around. But you thank George Hunt for that, because, and they didn't, a lot of times these are put on the ballot in protest of something the legislature's done, or in many cases, what they wouldn't do, so that they put the voters got around it. I am very strong. I think the initiative referendum are great devices, and many people in legislatures I can understand would think differently. And there's been that long history of really opposing it from that point of view.
That's so fascinating, right? Because the citizen initiative, the recall, that is so, for me at least, kind of looking at the early statehood period, that is so Arizona, right? It's so rooted in who we are as Arizonans. And so contemporary challenges to those ideas are so fascinating to me, because that's part of the reason why Arizona is the way it is. So, Dr. Berman, we had, before folks had joined us, we had talked about, there's so many fascinating, colorful stories from this time period. Hunt is such a colorful figure, and there are several episodes in Hunt's kind of late territorial political career, early gubernatorial career, that are so colorful. The whole journey to statehood. So I guess let's start there. What is that journey to statehood like for Arizona? And then we can kind of transition into Hunt as first governor.
Well, the journey was a very long one for statehood, 1863 to 1912. It was I'd be honest about it. I think for most of the early period, nobody really gave a damn about Arizona. It was out there. It was in the Wild West with strange people. They were hot as hell. And they had no water, and it was like hell. I mean, figured these are the two characteristics of hell. And the people there were often looked upon as people who couldn't make it or weren't wanted in the East, except by law enforcement people, perhaps. And they came out here to change their names and get a new start. And the image of Arizona really being part of the Wild West was a hard one to shake, because Pulp Fiction and writers would talk about it. And so people were thought they were, I think there was a line that was used by a young lady whose parents were taking her to Arizona, and she said, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Arizona." It was sort of a hell of a place to be in. And so it wasn't until the people figured out that there were some good things in the ground that maybe they could use to look at Arizona as an underdeveloped country that they could use to take the resources out. But Arizona was, I just really didn't have much going for it in terms of appealing to people as we want you in our, as a state. A territory, okay, we can watch you over you, because we can put appoint the governor and all these people. But the other obstacle was political. Arizona the people who voted anyhow were Democrats by and large. The people in Washington often were Republicans during that period.
Dr. Berman, can I interrupt you really briefly? Can you talk about that tension, right? Because this is, of course, before a political realignment. So Democrats of this time period and Republicans of this time period are very different from those of today. Could you talk about that a little bit before you move on with this story?
Well, the Democrats had lost the Civil War, and the Democrats were, on the other hand, there was a period when William Jennings Bryan became the leader of the Democratic Party, and he was a strong populist, really. And Hunt became Hunt's family were populist and followers of Bryan, and the Republican Party was at the time probably a little bit. The South was pretty conservative, where the Democrats were. The Republicans were the party of Lincoln, and they attracted a lot of Hispanic voters and Black voters, African American voters. They were the party of reform for a while until corporations started to be more important to them. But the real thing, and it's still true today, I mean, it's always been true on statehood. Each party wants a benefit from it by adding the new state. We had to put Alaska and Hawaii at about the same time. So one was Democrat and one was Republican. In Arizona, Republicans thought the good idea would be to combine Arizona and New Mexico, so that the larger state, which was New Mexico, which was a Republican state, would dominate, and Arizona would be sort of brought into. They would avoid having Arizona separately and two Democratic senators, and they would just be Republican senators. And so the move was made to have joint statehood, put the two together. That was very unpopular in Arizona. Unfortunately for them, they required two separate votes, both of whom both states had to approve the merger. And they was very popular in New Mexico, and not popular at all in Arizona. And so the joint idea failed. And once that failed, then there was momentum to enter both of them. And that's how we got in. But it was Hunt was caught up in those things, and Hunt was among the people who wanted to make sure that if we had statehood, we also had the initiative, referendum, and recall in our Constitution, and that was what they pushed for mostly more than anything in the Constitutional Convention. Hunt was a character. He in 1916. When the returns came in, it was announced that Thomas Campbell, a Republican, had defeated him. And Hunt reacted by locking himself in the Capitol building. He wouldn't open the door, and he sent out a message saying, "I'm not leaving, and I'm challenging this, and I want to stay in office." And he was not a good loser, and he did worry about getting elected all the time. He had when he was no longer he decided, that was in 1916. In 1918, he said, "I'm not going to run anymore. I'm going to look for something else to do." And he spread the rumors that he was going to run for the U.S. Senate against a conservative Democrat, Marcus Smith. Smith was in office, and he was very close to Woodrow Wilson. And he said, it'd be a good idea if you'd find a job for George Hunt. He's worked hard for the party, preferably somewhere far away, so he wouldn't be running for the Senate against me. And Wilson went along with it, and he found a job for Hunt. He went to Siam as an ambassador, and he sort of liked to travel, but the only reason he got there is because Smith was afraid he was going to run against him in the primary, and he might lose. So he sort of spread the rumor and really got Smith all concerned. It went to Wilson, and they got rid of Smith, and Smith got rid of Hunt. He spent most of his time as ambassador to Siam looking for knickknacks to send back to various people. I run a couple of people who have the ancestors of prominent politicians in Arizona who have some of the things that trinkets that Hunt sent back to him. But
wow.
he was I don't know if they're valuable. When I was doing my research, I did a book on George Hunt, and I went to Huntsville. That's where he was born. It was named after his grandfather, he was one of the founding fathers who threw a gala party filled with a lot of booze to the residents at the time they were trying to determine who should be what the name of the town should be, and they decided he was so generous and they were so drunk that they decided to vote for him, and so it became Huntsville. He got the name of the town. He was an interesting character. He was a Baptist who lived in Huntsville, which had two denominations basically, and they still have the same two denominations, and you're either a Baptist or you're a Methodist, and the two do not always get along, at least particularly in his era. He was beaten. He told a couple of Methodist boys that they were going to hell, and they promptly beat him up. He was closer to his mother than he was to his father. His father had trouble with booze, and when he got real intoxicated, took some of his meanness out on his son. And George, he was raised in poverty. The father had trouble keeping a job, and the mother was actually a very came from a fairly respected family. She was a daughter of the American Revolution, DAR. Her ancestors went way back. George became a son of the American Revolution, and actually the group in Arizona did a lot to restore his gravesite, a pyramid really in Papago Park, which was somewhat deteriorated, and the DAR local here did a lot to restore that. I'm going a little bit on here, but George ran away from home about the time he was 18, and they had a lot of adventures, hopping on trains and off trains, and came into Arizona with a couple of burros and in the Globe, and made his career there. But he was always character. He was not well educated. He lived on the farm he lived on was a subsistence farm. They had one that you ate what you grew. It was you had you sold what you could, but they had to live on their own very limited income. And he worked with his three brothers and sister on the farm. He didn't have time to go to school. When he did go to school, he didn't have time to. He didn't have the money to buy a textbook. And actually, when he became governor, the first thing they did was to give free textbooks to kids who were going to school. He remembered that. That was a terrible embarrassment for him to sit in the school not having a textbook. He was considered to be, by his opponents, when he ran for governor, he's illiterate. He doesn't, and other people were writing his speeches and whatever. He had to go through an awful lot of abuse, but he had a friend named Mulford Windsor, who was very just a good journalist writer, an intellectual, very much concerned into the progressive mainstream. He knew what was happening where and whatever. Who wrote some of Hunt's speeches, but Hunt was a true, I think, compassionate man who really learned by listening, and he campaigned very often by just talking to people, sitting in the Globe on a bench, talking to whoever came by, or sitting with them. He had a remarkable talent to remember names. He actually wrote them. He'd go to a town and write down their names, and a little bit about the stories that they told him. These were people on the street, and he'd come back in a couple of years, and he asked him, how did your son do it? I know he had broke his leg coming off. He would recant the stories that they told him. Everybody thought he was their friend. He developed this campaign, folksy style of campaigning that was very much copied by people like Ernest McFarland, who later on became governor. Not a great orator, but somebody who was a great friend, who was a common guy who would come and do favors for you. He built a lot of personal relationships. They're very close. But I don't think he could do it today. I think you need something else to get elected today. But this was a small state, and where new folks, and you could go around and become known to a good size of the electorate. So he'd write their names down, and he'd keep a good record of where he was going. I think he was not a television personality. You know who he was more like than anybody else, I think, was Bernie Sanders. Mm. He had an aggressiveness and a lot of themes about big business and wealth and all the things that Bernie Sanders talked about. They were totally different personalities. I mean, Bernie was from New York or Eastern. George was a folksy Midwesterner or Westerner. Not without temper. He had temper, but he was. I think he was really believed in working people and doing something for them and trying to make their lives better. The progressive era was not an era where many of the progressives had a reform package that had civil rights as an important factor. Arizona had very few African Americans in the population compared to South Carolina or something. But Hunt was, in two respects, colorblind. He was willing to defend the right of working people, no matter what their race or their ancestry. He was willing to also champion the rights of people to get a fair trial, to get treated in prisons like human beings, regardless of their race and their background. Many of the people who there was capital punishment was objected to because it was the poor man's privilege. They got it. They were given the death penalty. A rich white guy didn't. And the same thing was true with prison reform. Most people in prison were people who were unable to defend themselves. And there were a lot of people who probably shouldn't have been in prison. But it was, Hunt was appalled by that situation. He didn't care if they were Hispanic or Black or spoke English or didn't speak English. So in those two respects, he was a civil libertarian. He was the area where I think he and the Democratic Party failed in those periods where they did believe in a literacy test. And then using the literacy test to keep people out of the polls who were not going to vote for him. And unfortunately, most of the Hispanics and Blacks were Republicans, still with the party of Lincoln. So that the literacy test was used against until it was repealed by the Supreme Court, the it was used as a way of limiting participation. I've often thought it's interesting that minorities have often been in the wrong party at the wrong time. I mean, when they were Republicans, the Democrats were in, and when they were Democrats, the Republicans were in. Uh, they had a way of getting in the wrong time. But partisanship is Hunt and the progressives really wanted to get beyond partisanship. The theme was very often we need the facts. We don't want to go and do something simply because they're Democrats or Republicans. We want to know if people are unemployed, why. We need the data. Universities became popular in the progressive era because there were people there who were seriously objective, trying to dig up facts and information that you can make good decisions with. And Hunt was a partisan, but he was also, and like a lot of progressives, he wanted to know what the information was. Why do you do these things? Is it just not set from a general predisposition? Yeah, I think Hunt was very instrumental in helping out people, particularly in labor area. I noticed. I think you can say the labor history has been understudied in Arizona, and I've tried to do my own work on that, and I've focused pretty much on the role of the Western Federation of Miners, which was really made a big difference in Arizona's labor relations. They brought in all kinds of ideas into the political system, and led and helped bring the formation of what the Labor Party. I don't know if you know of the Labor Party, but it was formed by socialists and labor activists as a way of influencing what would go into the Constitution. You know, it wasn't really till the Constitution. I think when Arizona set out to write the Constitution in 1910, for the very first time, they got a hell of a lot of national attention. The focus was on Arizona, not just as a Wild West show, but as a serious place. And people from all over the country came to Arizona trying to influence that Constitution. And you had women suffragists, and you had direct democracy people. You had prohibitionists. You had everybody who had a cause trying to influence that document. And it became, after Oklahoma started the trend, really, the next major step toward progressive achievements. Progressives really hit their highlight about 1910 to 1912. Those are the big years, and those were the years when Arizona got on the map as leading the progressive cause. And Arizona was considered a very progressive state. That changed as time went on, but it has even now a very progressive constitution, which is not interpreted all the way it was when it was written, but it came out of the progressive era that way. I think in a way too, it became the next major event that made a difference in its status and its visibility in national politics came in 1917 during the what we call the Bisbee deportation, which really was going against the president's progressive accomplishments and really a sad time for organized labor.
Dr. Berman, could you briefly define for our audience who might not be familiar with the Bisbee deportation? Can you give us kind of like the 50,000-foot overview of kind of what that event is? And then, my final question for you as we kind of wrap up this hour is, which event from this time period do you think is still kind of with Arizonans today?
I think the basic deportation, it was in July 1917, I believe. There was a strike in Bisbee on some of the copper companies. The IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, were involved in the strike. Actually led it, and the companies involved decided that maybe the best thing to do is to deport the strikers, and they're working with the sheriff and with the citizen committee. A lot of the citizens are actually employees of the copper companies. They were, and they in the morning they just got up and rounded up as many wobblies and strikers, people who were on strike, put them on a train out of the ballpark in Warren, which is part of just outside of Bisbee, and put them in it was a train owned by the Phelps Dodge Corporation, and which is one of the companies that strikers were working against, and deported them out to eventually Columbus, New Mexico. I've gone down there. It's really a hell of a long trip to go to Columbus. I mean,
In a shuttle car, right? Like not a passenger car. It's not comfortable for sure.
No, and they stayed there until but they were those who tried to return very often were turned away at the borders by these home guards. Organized labor tried to look into the Arizona State Federation of Labor, sent some people down to Bisbee, and they were turned away. The home guards really were, you could call them vigilantes. I mean, they were people who took the law into their own hands and threw these people on the trains and rounded them up. They did have the support of the sheriff, so I guess you could say many of them were deputized, but it was an outstanding event that really got national attention, much more than the Constitution did. This was thought to be a horrible example of just extreme corporate domination. They were all excused out of the law of necessity. They had to take these actions because they were defending themselves. That kind of doctrine still goes in some places. You have the right to, if you're threatened, you have the right to take arms and shoot first. And unfortunately, it really encourages everybody to shoot first. It's sort of a dangerous doctrine, but there were no punishments for it. People were kidnapped and put on trains and sent off. There was a similar deportation up in Jerome. There's a movement now. I don't know how far it'll go, but I think some people are thinking about using the Warren ballpark. They play baseball there yet, I believe, but making it a shrine to the deportation. And under the National Park Service thing, like they have them in other places. I don't know how far that'll go, but I know there's been a movement out in that direction. Something to write books, people contact you with the ideas they have of doing things, but it really made the headlines. But for the people who applauded this was not like the people who applauded the Constitution. This had a different clientele to it. And you go down to Bisbee now and then, and you go to the courthouse and you run into people there who are really happy about the deportation. They really think it was a good thing, and we need more of that kind of stuff. And Arizona is pretty polarized. One reason I wrote the book on George Hunt is I don't think he's been given the recognition that he deserves in Arizona. I think the contemporary Arizona is has been, well, I think the conservatives are not happy with George Hunt, and they never have been. So that as they've come to power in Arizona, he's been pretty much ignored. I think that I'm not here to champion him, but I do think he did make a big difference in the state. And a lot of the issues he raised about corporations, power, and the need for redistribution of wealth, and something that we can't have an autocracy with billionaires calling the shots. The kind of issues he raised are the kind of issues that people are raising now, and so I think he's very relevant, and I think that he tells us a lot about where we've been and maybe where we want to go.
Yeah, I think Hunt and the progressives are not easy to put in a box, right? They're not easy to assign kind of partisan values to, and so that can be tricky for folks, especially because people who don't study history the way that perhaps you or I would study history, we're looking for, well, are they a hero or a villain? And everyone is in the middle, right? It's a lot more complicated than that. So sorry.
I was going to say it is very complicated, yeah, but it's not. It's unending. It's
Mhm.
it's not something we're going to solve. I don't think. We're just going to go through the cycles of change and non-change, and I think that one side sort of creates things that the other side's able to reverse. And so you do find there is some hope, at least for a while. The things you like are going to happen.
For sure. So before we take a couple questions from the audience, I just wanted to kind of, my final wrap up question for you is, which event from this time period, or maybe it's which person from this time period do you think impacts Arizonans the most today?
Well, at the end of the time period, I think the George Hunt focused on water uh, and protecting the Colorado River from being diverted to California, at least the water that should be going to Arizona. Uh, I think Hunt, after he got through the progressive period, he came back as governor from Siam. He's changed his focus. That's a very contemporary problem that's still with us, but I think the other problems still of the questions about the role of government, and particularly the state government, have been uh, still there. We have problems with social welfare services. I think at least some would argue that, and we have the divisions between, say, community and individualism seem to be salient in Arizona. One of the things that was sort of astounding about Arizona was the resistance to wearing masks and doing things that uh, they didn't want to do. There was a very strong individualistic streak in Arizona, and there is, on the other hand, a counter streak of we should get together and do things and solve our problems. Hunt was very much a communitarian. He wanted to get people aligned and he didn't want the individuals to go off and do their own things necessarily, make all the money they can, uh, live their own lives. And that streak is that tension between those two things, I think, are very much alive in Arizona.
Yeah, I think speaking of the late progressive era, right? Doing research on the Spanish flu and, you know, that community versus individual issue with the Spanish flu, you'd read a news article and go, wow, this could have been published in 2021. And it could be, you could run the same article. It's fascinating. Well,
Well,
Dr. Berman, thank you so much for your time today. We have time for a couple questions from the audience. And while those questions are coming in, is there anything that we didn't touch on today that you think folks should kind of explore as they're leaving this conversation?
oh, trying to remember what we talked about. I think that we covered the bases pretty well. The we it's one of the problems is that people don't know history and we're always redoing it. And there's a need for good, genuine research and people's willingness to consider it. And so much is done now, like it was when the progressives were protesting, as the people were acting upon instinct or bias or about other people without knowing the facts and not really researching things out. And truth is just whatever is good for your party. And that's really, we're not going to get very far doing that. And I think maybe we're naive in academia, thinking there is such a thing as truth, but I think there is, and we ought to be striving for that. And I think in a way, Hunt brought the focus on a lot of things that had been ignored, and I think he was very courageous. I thought he stuck his neck out. When he was elected, it was pretty by small numbers. he had a very difficult time getting support in some of the elections. Somebody lost in a way. But he was I think people being willing to speak out and be courageous, and he had the characteristics of a pretty good guy.
Well, speaking of Hunt, one of the questions that has come in, and I think it's a really good one, is kind of thinking about Hunt and other kind of Mountain West Pacific Coast governors of the same time period. The person who asked this question said specifically California and New Mexico, but you and I have also talked about Colorado. And so kind of where does Hunt fall with other governors of the Western states?
He doesn't have the reputation of Hiram Johnson and California at the same time. They were contemporaries, really. And he admired Johnson, who brought a lot of progressive reform to California. There was a governor of Oregon, whose name is, I'm struggling with. One of my things you as you get older, names just become obsolete things. You say, hello, kid. But he was, I think in terms of labor relations, he was outstanding, Hunt was. And there were very few, maybe Governor Wade of Colorado would be in his category. And there was a governor in Oregon who was very big on corrections and labor or prison reform kind of issues, and he was. But I think progressive governors as a whole were far more into direct democracy than they were in the East Coast, and were into women's suffrage and issues like that. I think the thing that the West was different, might have been different. It was new. It was. They didn't have long periods of tradition and that you would find in the East. It was one of the slogans of a guy who was a legislator from Tucson named Worsley was that Arizona is what we make it. It was barren. We have an opportunity to do things that that haven't been done because we're starting from scratch. And I think there are a lot of people in Wyoming and Utah and much of the West and then California too, even though it was larger, that there was an opportunity to do things that you couldn't do in the East, and you had a much more partisanship was not as intense in the West as it was in the East, too, and as deeply rooted. So that wasn't as much of a barrier for people getting along and working together on various projects.
Well, Dr. Berman, thank you so much for your time today. Thank everyone in the audience. And we'll see you in a couple weeks for the next program. Bye, y'all. Take care.